Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another Victober video. Today I'm going to be talking about where to start with quite a few different Victorian authors. This month already in Victober I have made a video on sort of tips for getting into Victorian literature, which I will link down below. And I said in that video that I wasn't going to make a video this year on like good books to get into Victorian literature with, because I have done that before. And I will link that video down below, but I thought I would do something today that is a little bit like that, but a little bit different. And that is talk about where to start with particular Victorian authors. Because one thing I do get asked quite a lot on this channel is like, where is a good place to start with Dickens, or where is a good place to start with Anthony Trollope? Because quite a lot of Victorian authors wrote quite a lot of books. So today I have picked out 10 like key Victorian authors. They aren't like the only key Victorian authors. There are many other Victorian authors who are important and well known and well read, etc. But these 10 Victorian authors are all Victorian authors that wrote several books and that I have read several books by, so I feel like I can tell you where is a good place to start and also where is a less good place to start. So let's get straight into them. So I will start off with Charlotte Brontë. She is the only Brontë sister I'm recommending where to start with, because Emily Brontë only wrote one book and Anne only wrote two, so you know there's not so many to choose from, but Charlotte Brontë wrote 4 books, and the book of hers I would recommend starting with is Jane Eyre, and this is in fact probably as well where I'd recommend starting with like the Brontës as a whole. Jane Eyre is a fantastic book. I think it's a really accessible Victorian novel. This is one of the first Victorian novels I ever read, and it's what got me into 19th century literature as a whole. Jane Eyre follows the life of a woman called Jane Eyre from her childhood into her adulthood, what happens when she goes and becomes a governess in a secluded house in Yorkshire, working as the governess to a ward of a man called Mr. Rochester, who is very mysterious, and everything goes on from there. It is gothic and exciting and dramatic. It's a brilliant love story, a brilliant like coming of age story about kind of finding yourself and your character and being strong and standing up for yourself. It's fantastic and I love it a lot. Jane Eyre is such a brilliant character, and this is a great place to start off with Charlotte Brontë, partly because I think it is one of her best and partly because it's so accessible. Villette by her is actually my favourite, just a little bit above Jane Eyre, but I think it's better to read Jane Eyre first in many ways, because Villette is like, it has some things in common with Jane Eyre, but it like takes certain things further and does certain things differently, and I think it's less accessible, and also it's all the more interesting if you've read Jane Eyre first. So yeah, I love Jane Eyre a lot and would highly recommend it as a great place to start with Charlotte Brontë, and indeed Victorian literature as a whole. The next author on my list is Wilkie Collins. So I haven't read all of Wilkie Collins by any means, but I've read 5 of his novels, and there are 2 in particular I would recommend to start with. One is The Moonstone. This is a very dramatic and exciting detective mystery novel. We follow what happens when a diamond called the Moonstone goes missing from a particular family house, and the book is told from the perspective of various people who were in this house or around the house, kind of solving the mystery of what happened to the Moonstone. It's really exciting and very accessible. But then another book by him which I love, which is probably my favourite book by him, is Poor Miss Finch. This is another sensationalist novel with a lot of drama and a lot of excitement, but one of the things that I find really interesting about this is the way that it looks at disability and disfigurement within the Victorian period. One of the main characters in this book, Miss Finch, is blind, and our narrator comes to work with her, for her, as her companion, and finds Miss Finch much more capable than she expected, which is quite nice. But then there is another character later on in this book who suffers from some kind of physical disfigurement, and the way that is explored is really interesting too. I just think this is a fascinating book and one I would highly recommend, and a really accessible place to start with Wilkie Collins too, and a bit less well known than The Moonstone. Also, when you're going into Wilkie Collins, there is one book I would like to tell you in particular to avoid. Whatever you do not start with The Two Destinies. Probably don't read it at all unless you really love Wilkie Collins and want to read all of them, because it is mad. It is completely mad. I really didn't like it. The ending was appalling in like so many ways. Like it was really odd, and I didn't like it, and I don't know what Wilkie Collins was doing, but whatever he was doing, it was not good. Do not read The Two Destinies. Definitely not a good place to start with Wilkie Collins. I think if you start with Wilkie Collins there, you'll probably never read anything else by him, and that'll be a shame because he has many other great books. Next on my list is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. More specifically, I am talking about his Sherlock Holmes books because I haven't read many of the other works by him that don't follow Sherlock Holmes. Now, the Sherlock Holmes series is a series, but unusually I would not recommend starting with the first book in the series, A Study in Scarlet. I think you can, but I wouldn't say A Study in Scarlet is the most accessible Sherlock Holmes book, because the first half of the book deals with Sherlock Holmes and Watson, these very familiar characters who have kind of permeated popular culture, but then the second half of the book completely goes away from them to America and follows like the backstory of the mystery, which I think kind of throws you out of the story a bit. I'm not sure that I love it, but I also think it's a bit inaccessible. Like literally halfway through the book, the story changes so much that listening to an audiobook, I thought there was a problem with the audiobook and I was suddenly listening to a different book entirely. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting with The Study in Scarlet, but I would highly recommend starting with the first short story collection, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, full of all of the things that you know from popular culture about Sherlock Holmes and Watson as characters. They're really, really engaging and I would highly recommend them. Really accessible, really compelling, really, really interesting mysteries. I'm also going to link down below in the description a video made by Claudia from Spencer's Library, where she talks about where to start with Sherlock Holmes, because that is very good to watch as well. Next on my list is of course Charles Dickens, who is an author I get asked a lot to where to start with. So one very good place to start with Charles Dickens is A Christmas Carol. A Christmas Carol is very good, it is very accessible, it is short, it is fun, you probably know the story from popular culture, and the story is very simple and the characters are fairly simple, but the writing is quintessentially Dickens. And if you want a book that will ease you into Dickens's writing style, then A Christmas Carol is really great for that, because his writing style is fantastic in A Christmas Carol. It's brilliantly written, it's such a good book, but also you probably know the story from popular culture and you'll find it quite easy to follow when you're getting into Dickens's writing style fresh. However, if you don't want to start with A Christmas Carol, or you know, if you're starting Dickens at a time that is not Christmas, then there are some other books I would recommend to start with. One thing I usually say about Charles Dickens is that his writing style is quite complicated. It's fine once you get into it, but if you are very new to Dickens's writing style, you might find it a little bit daunting. He does use a lot of words. He's very fond of a descriptive list, and he's also very fond of using absurdist imagery. Both of these things I love, but I think they do take a little bit of time to get into. And the other thing about Dickens, which I think can take a little bit of time to get into, is the fact that several of his books have like 10 plots, which I love. I love a book that has 10 plots and 40 characters. I love that in a book, but it's not always the easiest to get into, especially when you're also getting into a new writing style. And therefore I would recommend starting with one of Dickens's novels that is in the first person, such as Great Expectations, which is a fantastic book. This follows a young boy called Pip from his childhood into his adulthood. Pip grows up thinking he is going to be a blacksmith. He becomes an apprentice to a blacksmith, and then one day is told that he is going to inherit some money and he is going to become a gentleman, and suddenly he is spirited away to London to begin a new life. This is all in first person, which means you have a character you're following all the way through. You're really grounded with Pip, you get to know him so well as a person, meanwhile following all of the very many characters around him and getting used to Dickens's writing style. It's also not that long and it just is a fantastic place to start with Dickens. Another good place to start is David Copperfield. This is a bit longer, it's quite long, it's one of Dickens's longest, but I do think it's really, really accessible. Again, this is a first person narrative, a Bildungsroman. We're following David from his young childhood into his adulthood. His childhood is full of kind of misery and problems and a lot of strife, but he kind of grows through it and learns to kind of have a career for himself, find love and finds family, which is something he doesn't always have growing up. So it's a fantastic book, really, really well done and lovely, and I highly recommend it. And again, really, really accessible because you're following David all the way through. You get to know him as a person as well as following all of the characters around him. Even if you don't read these three books, I would recommend starting with a book that is from Dombey and Son onwards in publication order. I would say in general Dickens's early works are less strong than his later works, and they also tend to be a bit more theatrical, a bit more exaggerated, and the female characters tend to be much less interesting and much more passive. So I would say as a modern reader, his later works from Dombey and Son onwards are a lot more accessible. There are also three books amongst his early books which I would definitely not recommend starting with, and probably not recommend reading fairly early on in your Dickens reading experience. One is Barnaby Rudge. I really like Barnaby Rudge, but it's the most inaccessible Dickens book, I would say. One, because it is set in the 1780s, it's historical fiction, and it relies on the reader knowing certain things about this particular historical time period and the events happening in it, which you would have done in the mid-19th century, but you won't necessarily now. Also because one of the main characters, Barnaby Rudge, has severe learning difficulties, and the way Dickens describes it is what for the time is considered sensitive, and all the language that it was like politically correct, that's an anachronistic term, but politically correct for the Victorian period, but it isn't now, so I think that is slightly jarring for a modern reader. And it's just, yeah, it's not the most accessible Dickens book. I also wouldn't recommend reading the Pickwick Papers that early on. I love the Pickwick Papers, but it doesn't have like an overarching plot. It's very episodical, which I think is just slightly weird when you read it if you haven't read that much other Dickens first. And I also definitely wouldn't recommend starting with Oliver Twist, partly because it's my least favourite Dickens and I just don't think it's that good, but also because while Oliver Twist is very, very, very famous, the story that has come into popular culture is not quite the same as the book, so I think it is a bit weird when you read the book. You probably know the story of Oliver Twist, the orphaned boy in the workhouse who ends up getting like caught up with a gang of thieves, and all of that is in Oliver Twist, but also the main villain in Oliver Twist is a man called Mr. Monk, who they very rarely put in any of the adaptations, and who you probably haven't heard of. There are lots of things about Oliver Twist that are really interesting. I would recommend reading it at some point, but I don't think it's the best place to start with Dickens because you probably think you know more about the plot than you do, and also because it's just not the best. It may be one of the most famous, but it is definitely not the best. That was a long Dickens tangent. Let's talk about the next author on my list. Next on my list is George Eliot. Now, many of you will know that I am not the biggest fan of George Eliot at all. I don't love her writing style. I don't super get on with it. However, I have read 5 of her books, so I do feel like I can recommend you a good place to start with George Eliot. The place I would most recommend starting with is Daniel Deronda. This is my favourite book by her, and I really, really like it. This follows a man called Daniel and a woman called Gwendolen. Gwendolen kind of gets caught up in a bad situation fairly early on in the book, and Daniel kind of meets Gwendolen, and they share a bond, but Gwendolen is off limits to him. But at the same time, Daniel meets this other young woman who is Jewish, and through her, Daniel learns much more about the Jewish community within the 19th century. This book is really, really interesting because of that, and because of many other reasons as well. So I think Daniel Deronda is probably her most accessible book and a really good place to start. I can also tell you where definitely not to start with George Eliot. Do not start with The Mill on the Floss. I'm partly saying this because I really hate it, and I don't often say about a book that I hate it, but I do hate The Mill on the Floss. But leaving that fact aside, The Mill on the Floss is such an acquired taste. I know some people love it, and I know a lot of people who hate it, and I know very few people in between. It's such an acquired taste that I think it's a really bad place to start with George Eliot. If I had read The Mill on the Floss first, I would have never read another book by George Eliot. And while I don't love George Eliot, I am still glad that I have read the 4 other books by her that I have read. I'm not glad I've read them on the floss. That was not a good use of my time. Next, I want to mention Elizabeth Gaskell, and I think the best place to start with Elizabeth Gaskell is North and South. This is her most famous book, and it is the one I started with, and it is fantastic. It follows a young woman called Margaret Hale, who has been brought up in the south of England and suddenly is uprooted by her father to move to the north of England. She moves there with her mother and her father and their servant Dixon, and suddenly learns an entirely new world in the industrial city of Milton, which is based on Manchester, and she meets various people in this mill town, including people who work in the mill who she befriends, and also a mill owner called Mr. Thornton. It's fantastic. Like, the social commentary and the examination of industrialization in this book is fantastic. It also has like my favourite love story in any Victorian novel. It is absolutely amazing, and yeah, I love it so much. There are also 2 books I would recommend not starting with when it comes to Elizabeth Gaskell. Both of these books are fantastic, and I would highly recommend reading them at some point, but possibly not as your first Gaskell. One is Cranford. I love Cranford a lot. It's very short, which I think means a lot of people pick it up before they've read any other Elizabeth Gaskell, and while it is fantastic, it's quite episodical. It doesn't have an overarching plot, and the narrator is not the main character. It's more about the people around her, which I think means it's a slightly unconventional novel, and therefore some people find it a little bit harder to get into. I would also not recommend starting with Sylvia's Lovers, which is a fantastic book, but there is a lot of use of dialect in the dialogue, which means some of the dialogue is very hard to read, so that's just something that might put you off, and therefore I think you're best to like read some more Gaskell before you get to that point, though it is an amazing book. Next on my list is George Gissing, and the place I would recommend starting with him is The Odd Women. This is a fantastic book, and it follows various characters, various women in the Victorian period. The idea behind the title is that in the late Victorian period there were more women than men living in England, which meant that there were statistically going to be a lot of women who were not married. And basically this book looks at what unmarried women did in the Victorian period, what you could do, and how changing technology in the 1880s, such as the invention of the typewriter, means suddenly there are more options for women. There are more things you can do. Suddenly there are new options for women. And that is fantastic and really interestingly explored. This is an incredibly feminist book, full of such interesting observations about gender in the Victorian period. One of the reasons why I would suggest starting with this Gissing book, aside from the fact that I absolutely love it and it's amazing, is that Gissing in general is quite miserable. His books are pretty sad. Like, take Hardy as one level of tragedy, and then Gissing is like a little bit higher, even more tragedy. Gissing is fantastic, and I love him a lot, but The Netherworld and New Grub Street, the other two books I've read by him, are so amazing, but really, really depressing. The Odd Women is depressing in some points, and there is a lot of tragedy and a lot of sadness in this, but the fact that it is so positive about women's rights, and the fact that it is so infused with this feeling that there is something better for women, makes it, I think, a really empowering and really enjoyable read, as well as some of the sadness. So I think it's a slightly less depressing read than some of Gissing's other books. Next up, I have Thomas Hardy. There are two books which I would recommend starting with for him. One is Far from the Madding Crowd, which is one of my real favourites. This is a fantastic book, and in this we follow a woman called Bathsheba Everdeen. She inherits a farm from her uncle and goes off to be a farmer, which is quite unusual for a woman in the Victorian period. And she decides that she is going to manage his farm herself, that she is going to rule over the men who work on her farm, that she is going to prove to them that she can do it. And we follow her running the farm and also her relationship with various men around her. It is fantastic, it is brilliant. There are several reasons why I recommend starting with this Hardy novel. One is just that it's very accessible. Two is that it's not as depressing as some of his other books, and I think you need to ease yourself in to the misery of Hardy. Another book I would recommend starting with by him is The Return of the Native. This is a really fantastic novel in terms of its setting. It's all set around this like huge heath that is really desolate. Like, the setting is so fascinating in Return of the Native, and we follow various characters who are all kind of drawn together by this place, including a man who has recently come back to his home village after travelling abroad, and we follow all of the people around him, and there is a love pentagon, I think. Yeah, at least 5 characters in a big mesh of complications. Like Far from the Madding Crowd, I think this is a really accessible Hardy novel, and like Far from the Madding Crowd, it has a lot of misery in it, but a little bit less misery than some of the other Hardy novels, and therefore it's quite a good place to go into. There are also a few Hardy novels I would definitely recommend not starting with. Do not start with Jude the Obscure. It is fantastic, it is my favourite Thomas Hardy novel, but it is very, very miserable, and you need to prepare yourself for that. You need to build up to that level of misery. Also, do not start with Tess the D'Urbervilles for the same reasons. And I also think Tess the D'Urbervilles is Thomas Hardy's most famous novel, I would say. And it is really good, but I don't think it is as good as some of his other books, and I think it's become very famous because the idea and the premise and the point it's trying to make is fantastic, but in terms of the writing and the characterisation, I don't think it's actually necessarily as interesting as some of his other books. Also, do not start with The Well-Beloved, because that book is mad. That novel is like a Two Destinies level of like, what on earth are you doing? Like, seriously, Hardy, what are you thinking of? What is happening here? The Well-Beloved is for Thomas Hardy completionists. Also, if you read that first, you will never read anything else by Thomas Hardy, so don't do that. I'm also going to link down below a video recently made by Libby Stevenson, where she goes through like her whole suggested reading order for Thomas Hardy, which I think is fantastic, and goes very similarly with what I have just said, but also like goes into a bit more depth about the order once you've read Far from the Madding Crowd and The Return of the Native. It's a really, really good video. I'll link it down below. Also, you should go and watch Libby's channel in general, because she's great, especially on Thomas Hardy. Also, she loves The Well-Beloved, just if you want an alternative opinion from me. Next up, I have Anthony Trollope. Anthony Trollope is a really hard author to suggest where to start with, because he has written a lot of books, and also he wrote 2 big series, and his 2 big series, the Basset Chronicles and the Palliser novels, are 2 of the most famous things by him. And I think it can be very daunting to start with a Victorian author with a whole series, especially when they're both 6-book series and both of them contain some pretty long books, especially the Palliser series. Like, every book in that is like more than 500 pages, and nearly every book in the Barsetshire Chronicles probably is too. I don't necessarily think they're the best place to start with Anthony Trollope's work, but I do have a few other suggestions of places to start. One is Dr. Wurtle's School. This, I think, is like the perfect place to start with Anthony Trollope. It's not very long, it's really accessible, it's really engaging, it's got a great plot and great characters, but it also really introduces you to like the way Trollope looks really interestingly at social issues in the Victorian period. We follow a man called Dr. Wurtle who has a school, and we follow various people who work in the school. And what happens when Dr. Wurtle discovers that a particular married couple who work in his school have a secret. It's fantastic. I would highly recommend it. This is usually the book I say when people ask me where to start with Anthony Trollope, but I do realise a few people have said it's quite hard to get because it's not that well known. So I do have 2 other suggestions which I think are a bit easier to get your hands on. One is The Way We Live Now. This is one of my favourite Trollope books. It's not a short, but it is really fantastic. This follows what happens when a family called the Melmots suddenly appear in London with a lot of money, and no one knows where they've got their money from, but everyone's very excited to meet them because they have a lot of money, and we follow various people who like exist around them. I think it's a fantastic book. I think it's really engaging. It has a lot of plots and a lot of characters, but I do think it is fantastic and so readable and so thoroughly enjoyable and such a compelling, wonderful read. And the way this looks at money and class is just absolutely fascinating. And then the other one by Trollope I would recommend is Rachel Ray. This is very different. This is quite a sweet, quiet love story, quite different, I would say. I really, really like it. I haven't read it for a long time. I'd really like to reread it actually, but it's a good place to start with Trollope because I think it is very, very accessible. Well, it is really enjoyable. It's a bit shorter, but it will give you a nice introduction into Trollope. Finally, I have H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells is a brilliant writer, and there are 2 books I would recommend in terms of where to start with him. One is one of his sci-fi books and one is one of his non-science fiction books. The sci-fi book I'd recommend starting with by H.G. Wells is The Time Machine. I love this book. It's a very short novella, really accessible, really engaging and very interesting. And it tells the story of a man who gets in a time machine and travels to the future and finds in the future a very divided society where humankind is kind of like diverged into 2 different species, and it's really, really interesting, really engaging, very short and accessible. And the other place I would recommend starting with for H.G. Wells is Love and Mr. Lewisham. Love and Mr. Lewisham is a great book. We follow a man called Mr. Lewisham who is from the kind of upper working / lower middle class and is trying to like bring himself up in the world. And we follow him as he tries to do this and how kind of love gets in his way. And a place I would really recommend not starting with for H.G. Wells is The War of the Worlds. I think probably a lot of people start here because it's one of H.G. Wells' most famous books, but I really don't think it's that accessible or that good. It's my least favourite H.G. Wells by quite a long way. I love H.G. Wells, but The War of the Worlds is very thin on characterisation. It is very, very premise driven rather than plot or character driven. It's really hard to like fully connect with it because the main character is just a kind of everyman figure without any personality. Which means I think it is just quite hard to get into, and therefore I don't think it's the best place to start with H.G. Wells. It is an interesting read, but I don't think it will give you a full impression of everything that H.G. Wells can do. And there we have it. That's where to start with 10 different famous Victorian authors. I hope this video was useful. Please do let me know down in the comments if it was. And that is all. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.